Fed up with his kids' entitled attitudes and their lazy lifestyles, a wealthy dad decides to teach them a lesson they won't forget. He cooks up a plan to make them think the family's fortune has gone down the drain. Stick around until the end to see the unexpected turnaround. Welcome to your daily dose of Movie Pill. Today, we'll be looking at a 2021 movie titled Spoiled Brats. Spoilers ahead, and let's dive right in. Francis Bartek, a widower of Polish descent, made his millions in construction after moving to France. Now living it up in Monaco, he's got two sons, Philippe and Alexander, and a daughter named Stella, but none of them lift a finger for work. They're too busy spending daddy's cash. Alexander's always ditching class for flings with women of all ages. Stella's a shopaholic, and Philippe's forever dodging his dad's business chores for partying. Plus, they're all total jerks to the servants. One morning, Philippe shows up at Francis's office with this crazy idea, paying folks to break in your shoes before you wear them. Francis, still soft on his kids since their mom passed away, kinda entertains the idea, saying he'll think about it. But then his buddy Ferruccio bursts the bubble, calling out how ridiculous it is. After Francis hands Philippe a package for the company, Ferruccio gives him a piece of his mind, saying it's time to stop using their mom's death as an excuse. It's been 15 years, and they're grown-ups now. Meanwhile, at the Bartek mansion, Stella's birthday bash is kicking off. Her lazy Argentinian boyfriend, Juan Carlos, steals the spotlight with his stories about home, while constantly professing his love for Stella. But Stella's patience wears thin as she keeps asking for juice, and it's nowhere in sight. She storms into the kitchen, ready to give the staff a piece of her mind, but her rant is cut short by Matthias, an old acquaintance working with the catering crew. He doesn't hold back, teasing her about being happy to see him only because he'll be working at her event all night. Meanwhile, Francis retreats to his home office for a bit before joining the party. He talks to a portrait of his late wife, wondering where he messed up. He gets a bit touchy when his housekeeper, Marguerite, suggests he's feeling down. His departure from the room is prompted by the commotion outside, where he catches Juan Carlos trying to open an expensive bottle of vintage champagne with a golf ball, causing chaos. He's obviously messed up, but instead of owning it, he blames the waiter for moving the bottle. Later, he and Stella ask for a private chat, so he takes them back to his office, casually cleaning his shotgun as they talk. Francis clearly isn't a fan of Juan Carlos, and he doesn't hold back when he finds out about their marriage plan. He calls out Juan Carlos for planning to use Francis's money instead of the supposed riches in Argentina. Stella, getting frustrated, reminds Francis of his history of being an absent father. She's not asking him for his blessing, she's just giving him a heads up before they storm out to keep the party going. While Stella joyfully announces her engagement to the entire party, her best friend becomes upset. Meanwhile, Francis receives a call from Ferruccio, who confirms his suspicions. Philippe neglected the chores they assigned him and instead attended a party, as evidenced by a video he posted on social media. Just then, the principal of Alexander's school arrives at the house, furious not only about Alexander skipping classes, but also for his affair with the principal's wife. To everyone's shock, Alexander appears at the top of the stairs, flanked by both the principal's daughters, revealing that he's been involved with them as well. The principal tells Francis he's sorry for accepting Alexander into his school as a favor, especially since no one else wanted him. Seeing all his kids in trouble like that is the final straw for Francis. He has a heart attack from all the stress. Later in the hospital, Francis wakes up with Ferruccio by his side. The kids show up too, but instead of being decent, they start bickering over stupid stuff, making Francis's heart rate shoot up again. Ferruccio kicks them out and asks Francis if he thinks his wife would be proud of him. 2 months later, the three siblings rush to the house, freaking out because their credit cards and phones are blocked, and there's no Wi-Fi. Suddenly, cops show up, claiming they have a warrant and seizing their cars. In a bold move, Francis shows up with his shotgun, telling his kids to follow him to sneak out. They hit the road and Francis stops a random driver at gunpoint, forcing them to give up their car so the family can make a getaway. After they're out of view, Ferruccio pops up next to the driver and pays him off. On their way to Marseille for safety, Francis spills the beans about the company's mess. Some funds got messed up, freezing their accounts and landing them in hot water for fraud. And guess who's the prime suspect? Ferruccio, who conveniently disappeared the day before. Francis stresses the importance of keeping quiet until they sort things out. He grabs their phones and tosses them in the street to avoid being tracked. When they get to Marseille, the siblings are shocked by how simple life is for the middle and lower class. And things take a dive when their dad brings them to their crash pad, his old childhood home, now in a sorry state. With half the light bulbs out and everyone bunking up, it's not exactly luxury living, but it'll have to do. Over a dinner of fried bread, Francis drops the bomb. They've got to find jobs to make ends meet. So, bright and early the next morning, he wakes them up at 6 to hit the job hunt. Meanwhile, he stays back, fixing up the house to keep a low profile and avoid any run-ins with the law. Since their dad fed them all their lives, now it's their turn to look after him. Getting ready to go out is a bit of a hassle too. The tap water's gross, and the sink is right next to the toilet with no door in between. So, Stella sprays perfume on herself while watching Philippe do his business without any toilet paper. Meanwhile, Alexander tries his luck at a construction site, sneaking a bite to eat from some workers who quickly kick him out and suggest he talk to their boss if he's serious about getting a job. Stella snags a phone from some guy on the street and goes against her dad's wishes by calling Juan Carlos to let him know she's vacationing with the fam, using up the stranger's phone minutes in the process. Meanwhile, Philippe hits up a buddy who's always backed his wild ideas, hoping for some cash to fuel his latest scheme. But his friend admits he thinks Philippe's ideas are straight up silly, and he only went along with them for a laugh during their partying. A while later, both Alexander and Philippe come back home empty-handed from their job hunt. Stella doesn't fare any better on the job front, but she comes back with some fancy shopping bags filled with pricey clothes. Turns out, Stella scored some cash by selling Philippe's watch, but instead of using it for essentials like food, she went on a shopping spree. This sets off a big argument amongst the siblings, and as payback, Philippe dumps soap all over her new clothes. Their fight gets cut short when Marguerite and Matthias unexpectedly show up. Stella had called them earlier. Marguerite brings towels and spare clothes, and Matthias offers Stella a job interview at the restaurant where he works. Marguerite even tries to lend them some money from her savings, but Frances refuses, making her promise to keep quiet about the situation before she leaves. The next day, Stella heads over to the restaurant and scores a trial gig as a waitress. She struggles a bit with balancing the tray and accidentally drops a few things, but she rolls up her sleeves and gets down to washing dishes and prepping fish without too much grumbling. Dealing with demanding customers drives her nuts, and it takes a while for her to get the hang of managing multiple tables and taking orders on the fly. Meanwhile, Philippe swings by a job agency. The clerk's jaw drops when Philippe confesses he's got zero experience or qualifications, but still wants a high-paying senior management gig with a company car, all under the table because of his run-ins with the law. After talking him down on his salary hopes, the clerk hooks Philippe up with a job as a bike taxi driver, but it's a struggle for him, especially with his weight making cycling tough. He's so slow that his rival driver, Malek, ends up snagging all his clients. Meanwhile, Ferruccio sneaks over to Frances's place with some fancy wine and lobsters. At first, Frances hesitates to dig in, not wanting to seem unfair to his kids, but eventually he caves and enjoys the feast. When Frances mentions he's planning to keep busy fixing up the house, Ferruccio wonders if he's doing it just for the sake of his siblings. Out of the blue, they hear some commotion coming from the house, so they grab their shotgun and head in to investigate. Turns out, Alexander skipped out on job hunting and just slept all day. Frances hurriedly sends Ferruccio away and rushes to clean up the dishes before Alexander catches him red-handed. But it's too late. Alexander spots the lobster shell, and Frances has to come up with a quick excuse. He spins a tale about catching the lobster himself, and Alexander buys it, thinking nature always provides. By the end of the day, Philippe and Stella manage to bring home some cash. Frances splits it between food and house repairs. When they find out all Alexander did was make a hammock and snooze all day, they're livid and refuse to share dinner with him. Alexander blows them off, saying he doesn't need their help, and heads out to scavenge for acorns, apples, berries, and whatever else he can find around the house. But all those wild snacks end up making him sick later on. The next day, Frances suggests that Alexander can earn his keep by helping him fix up the house. Alexander wonders why Frances never sold the place, especially since they never used it before, but Frances just says it's sentimental. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Stella gets into a spat with a customer who's super rude to her because his dish is missing an ingredient. Feeling fed up, Stella thinks about quitting, but Matthias reminds her that she's been rude to the waiters in the past, so she shouldn't be shocked to get some attitude in return now. Stella wakes up to reality and decides to stick around and be more down to earth. Matthias gives her a glimpse onto how they handle rude customers. The cooks spit on their food. After that, Stella steps up her game, going the extra mile by mopping floors and tackling dishes as needed. Later that night, the siblings squabble over who's on dish duty, and Philippe accidentally spills the beans about Stella's past struggle with anorexia. Frances is stunned by the news and wonders why she didn't reach out to him for help. The siblings remind him that he's always been absent, listing the times he's missed out because of work. Stella battled bulimia for a year, losing 10 kilos. Alexander got caught with pot and spent a night in jail. And when Philippe was hospitalized for 2 weeks with peritonitis, his dad was in Japan and couldn't be bothered to cancel his business trip to visit. But they know their mom wouldn't have thought twice about flying over. Feeling like he's on trial, Frances storms out of the room, insisting he can't be blamed for all their problems. The next day, Philippe gets fed up with Malek always swiping his clients and decides to confront him about it. Initially, they argue, and it looks like they might throw punches, but they bond over their shared obsession with collector sneakers and end up becoming pals. Meanwhile, back at the house, Alexander wows Frances by fixing the plumbing. When Frances asks how he learned to do it, Alexander spills the beans about a high school prank where he and his buddies rerouted the waste pipe into the principal's shower. For that stunt, he had to study plumbing tutorials for 2 months. Back in Monaco, Juan Carlos is hooking up with Stella's best friend, who spills the beans about the rumors circulating about the family's financial troubles and supposed culprit behind them. Juan Carlos finds this fishy, especially since he spotted Ferruccio at the country club just 2 days ago. So he decides to do some snooping around. Later that day, Frances apologizes for not being the best dad, explaining how tough it was for him to suddenly take on the roles of both father and mother. He reveals that they kept their mother's illness hidden to shield them from pain. The siblings feel like their dad thinks they're spoiled and clueless, but Francis reassures them that he's proud of them now. Afterwards, they have a fantastic evening together under the stars, sharing drinks and swapping stories from their younger days. The family starts to settle into their new life, pitching in with chores and sprucing up the house while enjoying each other's company. Stella hits it off with her coworkers at the restaurants, and Malik gives Philippe some pointers on being a better bike taxi driver. They even team up to make some cash off Malik's sneaker collection. But then, Ferruccio calls Francis and warns him to cut it out because Juan Carlos has been poking around. Unfortunately, it's too late. Juan Carlos shows up at the house a few hours later, revealing that he found out about Francis's lie by following Ferruccio. Francis offers Juan Carlos a blank check to get him to leave them alone, but Juan Carlos refuses, saying he genuinely wants to help. When the siblings show up, Juan Carlos reveals he's sold off his properties in Argentina to clear the family's debts, giving them access to their accounts in the mansion again. To avoid letting his kids know he lied to teach them a lesson, Francis plays along with Juan Carlos's act and agrees to go back to Monaco. On their way home, Juan Carlos suggests they can now get hitched, and although Stella agrees to a kiss, she seems less sure about it this time. The next day at breakfast, Francis confides in Marguerite about feeling guilty and worrying about Stella marrying someone like Juan Carlos. Marguerite encourages him to come clean. Later, when Francis talks it over with Ferruccio, his friend agrees, so Francis decides to bite the bullet and talk to the kids. Knowing Francis might spill the beans at any moment, Juan Carlos whisks Stella off to elope. Although Stella isn't thrilled, Juan Carlos promises they'll have a proper celebration later. As they head to the city hall, Francis tries calling Stella, but Juan Carlos intercepts and pretends everything is fine, hiding Francis's angry yelling. He hangs up on Francis and tells Stella that her dad is cool with the union, while Francis grabs his son and rushes to halt the wedding. The deputy mayor, who's officiating, happens to be mute, so things are dragging along. Finally, when the ceremony gets going, Stella finds out that Juan Carlos's real name is Kevin Laputre. He spins some tale about his dad being a refugee who had to change their name. Despite his story, Stella's family bursts in. Francis spills the beans. Juan Carlos is after Stella's money, and he never actually sold his properties to bail them out. The whole financial crisis was just a story Francis made up to teach the kids a lesson. The cops they saw at their house? Those were just actors. Stella gives Juan Carlos a solid slap for his antics, then storms out of the room with her siblings, all of them swearing off talking to their dad forever. 9 months later, Francis hasn't heard a peep from his kids except for those monthly checks they send him for living in his childhood home. He's been stashing them all in a glass bowl, refusing to cash a single one. After a business meeting with some clients, Ferruccio pulls a sneaky move while driving, taking them down to a different road that ends up leading to Francis's old house. He even has flowers in the trunk for Francis to give to Stella, since it's her birthday. Inside the house, the siblings are all doing great. Philippe and Malek are hustling selling trainers. Alexander's got his hands dirty as a plumber, and Stella and Matthias are gearing up to open their own restaurant. But when Francis shows up, the mood goes south quickly. He notices the awkward vibes and decides to just hand Stella the flowers, say sorry one last time, and bounce. Feeling a bit guilty, the siblings decides to cut him some slack and patch things up. They call him back, invite him to join the party, and decide to celebrate as a family. As the story comes to a close, we see the Bartek siblings finding their footing and making strides in their individual pursuits. Despite the bumps along the way and the rocky relationship with their father, Francis, they ultimately come together as a family. Through trials and tribulations, they learn to forgive and support each other, embracing the bond that ties them together. I rate this movie a 7 out of 10. Comment down below what you would rate it. 9 out of 10 doctors suggest taking another movie pill. So, take another one with this movie about Cad Uridim.